Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, let the day soften around you, and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1, Dawn at the Caravanserai. Before the sun rose fully over the dry hills, the caravanserai rested in a blue-gray hush. Its outer walls stood thick and quiet against the fading night. In some places, they might have been made of mud brick, warm-colored and smooth where many hands had repaired them over the years. In other regions, stone blocks held the coolness of darkness a little longer. The walls were plain from the outside, built more for shelter than for beauty, with one main gate set into their face like a calm, watchful doorway. Inside was an open courtyard, a broad space under the sky. A courtyard is an open area enclosed by buildings or walls, and in a place like this, it was the heart of the inn. Around it were rooms, raised platforms, storage corners, and shaded places where travelers could sit, cook, speak softly, or roll out their bedding. Near one side, animals rested in their own area, close enough to be tended, and far enough to leave the center clear. The dust of the courtyard lay still. It had been stirred the evening before by hooves, sandals, wheels, and the dragging of bundles, but now it rested in a fine pale layer over the packed earth. A wooden trough stood near the wall, its water catching the first thin line of morning light. Somewhere nearby there may have been a well or a cistern, a storage place for water, often built underground to keep it cool and safe. Water shaped every day of travel along these routes. It decided when people rose, where animals could be led, and how far a caravan might go before stopping again. A few camels shifted on folded legs. Their long necks moved slowly. Their harness rings clicked in small, irregular notes. Some were Bactrian camels, the two-humped camels often used in the cold deserts and rough climates of Central Asia. Farther west or south, travelers might have known the one-humped dromedary camel instead. Horses, donkeys, mules, and oxen also served along different roads and in different seasons. The Silk Road was never one single path, with one single way of traveling. It was a changing network of land and sea routes, stretching across many regions of Eurasia, linking East Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, the Iranian world, the Mediterranean, and beyond. The name Silk Road itself came much later. It was coined in the 19th century by the geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen. The travelers in this courtyard would not have used it as one grand name. A merchant might speak of the road to Kashgar, or the way toward Dunhuang, or the next oasis, pass, river crossing, or market town. A guide might think in terms of wells, winter snows, summer heat, grazing places, and familiar hills. Goods and stories moved step by step through many hands, often changing owners several times before reaching distant cities. But at dawn, those larger patterns were quiet. What mattered first was the morning. The air was cool before the heat of day. It carried the smell of straw, wool, leather, and the faint smoke of last night's cooking fire. A cloak lay folded beside a sleeping mat. A pair of sandals rested neatly near a doorway. In one corner, a bundle wrapped in felt leaned against a wall. In another, a saddle blanket hung over a low rail, drying in the pale air. A caravanserai was a roadside inn or way station where travelers, animals, and goods could rest. The word is especially associated with Persian and Islamic world lands, though many regions had their own kinds of inns, relay stations, guarded stops, monasteries, village guest rooms, or simple camps. Some caravanserais were built or supported by rulers, wealthy patrons, religious endowments, or local authorities, because trade and travel depended on places to pause. A road was not only the track underfoot. It was also the well, the gate, the stable, the cook fire, and the person who knew whether the next spring was flowing. Along the courtyard walls, people began to wake. One traveler sat up slowly and wrapped a wool cloak around his shoulders. Another reached for a small cloth pouch and checked its tie without haste. A servant brushed dust from a rolled mat. A young stable hand moved among the animals, speaking in a low voice that seemed meant as much for the morning as for the beasts. He placed a hand on a camel's neck, checked a strap, and moved on. From a small hearth, gray ash held a memory of warmth. Soon someone would coax a new flame from embers or strike fire again. Bread from the previous evening might be warmed, Water might be poured into a clay vessel. A simple morning drink would steam in a cup, depending on the place and time. Perhaps hot water, perhaps an herb infusion, perhaps tea in regions and periods where tea had become part of daily life. Above the courtyard, the sky lightened by degrees. The upper edge of the wall glowed first, then the corners of windows, then the curve of a jar near the trough. A bird called once from somewhere beyond the gate. The animals answered only with soft breathing and the slow sound of chewing. A gatekeeper appeared near the entrance, his figure dark against the growing light. He moved calmly, as someone who knew the rhythm of many mornings. The great gate would not open all at once into a rush. First there would be checking, gathering, tying, counting, and watering. Travelers would fold blankets and tuck them into bundles. Merchants would look over bales of cloth, packets of dried fruit, boxes of glassware, or sacks of grain. Drivers would bring saddles and ropes into the open space. The caravanserai, so still a moment before, began to wake without hurry. A bell gave a small bright sound as an animal lifted its head. A water skin was carried toward the trough. A rolled bundle was set down gently in the courtyard, then another beside it. Low voices passed beneath the arches. The pale light widened, touching the dust, the walls, the folded blankets, and the waiting road beyond the gate. Chapter 2. Preparing for the day's journey. The first work of the morning began before the sun had fully lifted above the walls. In the courtyard of the caravanserai, the air still held the coolness of night. The packed earth was pale and firm underfoot, marked by the soft prints of sandals, hooves, and padded camel feet. A few oil lamps still glowed in sheltered corners, their light fading as the sky turned from blue-gray to rose. Travelers often rose early in dry country, especially near deserts and open plains, because the first hours of daylight were kinder than noon. The road would grow warmer later. For now, there was time to move carefully, to check each rope and knot, to eat a little, to fill the water skins, and to prepare the animals without hurry. Near the well, two men lowered a bucket by a rope that had been smoothed by many hands. The bucket touched water with a hollow sound, then rose slowly, dripping into the stone-lined opening. One traveler held open a water skin, a leather container made to carry water on the road. Another poured with care, letting the water settle before tying the neck tight with a cord. A water skin, like many things in a caravan, was simple and important. It had to be strong enough to travel over rough ground, light enough to carry, and sealed well enough to keep its contents from leaking into the dust. When full, it was laid beside other skins in a neat row, dark and rounded in the morning shade. Across the courtyard, saddle blankets were shaken out one by one. Dust lifted, floated briefly in the slanting light, and settled again. The blankets were thick with wool or felt, the pressed wool cloth that helped soften a load against an animal's back. A camel driver ran his hands along the edge of one blanket, feeling for worn places. Another checked a leather strap, then pulled it through a buckle and smoothed it flat. Packing a caravan was skilled work. A load had to be balanced so that one side did not pull harder than the other. A bale, meaning a large wrapped bundle of goods, might look quiet and still once tied, but on the road it would shift with every step. If it was packed poorly, it could rub, loosen, or tire the animal. So the drivers worked by touch as much as by sight, lifting, adjusting, waiting, then adjusting again. Some animals knelt patiently while their loads were prepared. In much of Central Asia, travelers often used Bactrian camels, the two-humped camels suited to cold deserts, rocky tracks, and changing weather. Their heavy coats could look shaggy in some seasons, and their broad feet moved well over sand and hard earth alike. Farther west and south, in hotter desert lands, caravans might use dromedary camels, the one-humped kind. Elsewhere, horses, mules, donkeys, oxen, and carts all had their place. The Silk Road was not one road only, and its animals were not one kind only. Each region used what suited its land, its climate, and its work. A camel folded its legs beneath itself with a low rumbling sound, not quite a complaint, and not quite a song. The driver spoke softly and laid a blanket across its back. Then came two bundles, one on each side, wrapped in reed matting and tied with rope. The driver stepped back, looked, and shifted one bundle a hand's width lower. Only then did he tighten the strap. Nearby, a wooden box scraped softly over the packed earth as two servants moved it toward a waiting cart. The box might have held metal goods, small tools, or household wares meant for a town not many days away. Not every caravan carried rare luxuries across great distances. Many loads were ordinary and regional: wool cloth for one market, dried fruit for another, leatherwork, pottery, grain, salt, or simple things needed by families and workshops. Still, famous goods traveled too, usually in stages, passing through many hands along the network of routes. There were folded silk textiles racked in cloth, smooth and light beneath their protective coverings. There were rolls of cotton cloth, bundles of wool, and thick felt mats. There might be small packets of spices or aromatics, fragrant substances used for cooking, medicine, ceremony, or scent. There could be dyes for coloring thread, medicinal substances carefully sealed, metal bowls, glassware cushioned in straw, ceramics nested together, and dried apricots, raisins, almonds, walnuts, or pistachios packed for trade or for food along the way. In some periods and places, paper might also be among the goods, wrapped against damp and dust. Paper began in China and spread westward over time, becoming important in many towns for letters, records, and books. It was not present everywhere at every date, but where it traveled, it carried more than itself. It helped carry words, accounts, poems, prayers, and news. The morning meal was modest. A cook lifted warm flatbread from near the hearth and laid it under a cloth so it would stay soft. People came in small groups, taking pieces with quiet thanks. Someone poured a simple hot drink into cups, and steam rose in thin, pale lines. In some regions and times, this might have been tea, especially where tea customs had spread. Elsewhere, it might have been boiled water with herbs, milk, or another local drink. The important thing, in that hour, was warmth in the hands, and a little food before the road. A boy sat near a doorway, sorting dried fruit into a small cloth bag. An older woman tied the bag closed and tucked it beside a bundle of bread. A merchant counted small packets without haste, touching each one and murmuring under his breath. Another traveler checked the seal on a wrapped parcel, making sure the cord had not frayed in the night. Around them, the caravanserai moved in a rhythm of preparation: fold, tie, lift, balance, pour, knot, check. The innkeeper passed through the courtyard with a calm eye for details. A caravanserai was a resting place, but also a place of many departures. Its work was to hold travelers for a night, give them water if water was available, shelter animals and goods, and let people gather themselves before the next stretch of road. By morning, it became a place of small farewells. One by one, the animals rose. A camel lifted its hind legs first, then its front legs, and the bundles swayed before settling into place. Donkeys shook their ears. A mule stamped lightly, and then stood still while its driver tightened a rope. The bells on a lead animal gave a faint sound, no louder than a thought at first. At the well, the last water skin was filled, tied, and lifted into place. A hand pressed the knot once, firmly, to be sure. The gatekeeper drew back the heavy door, and the widening opening filled with morning light. Beyond the caravanserai lay the road between towns, pale and quiet, waiting across the open ground. The first animals stepped forward slowly. Hooves, wheels, and padded feet passed under the arch. Low voices followed, and the bells began to sound in an easy rhythm. Behind them, inside the walls, dust settled again in the courtyard. Ahead, the day opened gently, and the caravan moved out into the cool morning. Chapter 3. The Road Between Towns. Beyond the gate of the caravanserai, the road began quietly. It was not always a road in the way one might imagine a road today. In some places it was a pair of wheel ruts pressed into dry earth. In others it was a footpath worn by many animals over many seasons, or a pale track along the edge of a desert, or a stony line between low hills. Sometimes there was no clear mark at all, only the knowledge of those who had crossed before, a guide's memory of a well, a distant ridge, a bend in a dry riverbed, or a stand of tamarisk trees where a little shade could be found. The caravan moved at a measured pace. Step by step, the animals settled into their morning rhythm. Hooves and padded feet touched the packed earth with soft, repeating sounds. Leather straps creaked as loads shifted gently from side to side. Small bells tied to a lead animal or a saddle cord gave a faint ringing that rose and faded with the movement of the line. Behind them, dust lifted in a thin veil, then slowly settled again. Travel along the routes now called the Silk Road was often slow and practical. The Silk Road was not a single highway, but a wide network of paths, linking towns, farms, deserts, mountains, river valleys, and seas. In one region, travelers might follow the edge of a great desert, moving from oasis to oasis. In another, they might pass along a river valley where reeds grew at the banks and fields opened near the water. Farther on, some routes turned toward corridors between mountains, where the land narrowed and the air grew cooler. People chose their roads carefully. A caravan might wait for the right season before beginning a difficult stretch. In the height of summer, some desert paths were better avoided during the hottest days. In winter, snow could close a high pass, a route through mountains. At other times, travelers listened for news of taxes, closed gates, damaged bridges, or unsettled districts. These matters did not always stop movement, but they shaped it. A wise journey was planned around weather, water, animals, and local knowledge. For this reason, caravans often traveled in groups. A caravan was simply a group of travelers and animals moving together. Some people were merchants carrying goods. Some were hired drivers who knew how to load and care for camels, mules, donkeys, horses, or oxen. Some were servants, cooks, guards, pilgrims, messengers, or people going from one town to the next for family or business. Not everyone was crossing the whole continent. In fact, most merchants did not travel all the way from East Asia to the Mediterranean with the same goods. Silk, spices, glassware, paper, wool, dried fruit, dyes, and many other things usually moved in stages, passing through many hands and many markets. One person might carry a bale of cloth from one oasis town to another. A second might buy it there and take it onward across a valley. A third might exchange it for metalwork, horses, or bolts of local wool. In this quiet way, goods traveled farther than most of the people who carried them. The guide rode near the front, sometimes on an animal, sometimes walking with a staff in hand. A guide was someone who knew the route and the local conditions. He might know which well was sweet and which was brackish, which spring flowed after winter rains, and which camping place had enough room for animals to kneel. He might know the shape of a hill seen at dawn, or a gap between distant ridges, or the place where a dry track divided, and one branch led toward a village, while another turned toward empty land. Progress was measured in such things, not only in miles, but in wells, springs, river crossings, known shelters, patches of shade, and the distance to the next oasis. An oasis was a water place in a dry region where plants and people could live. To reach one was to reach trees, gardens, animals in pens, mud brick walls, and the sound of water being drawn or guided through channels. But before the oasis came the open road, and the road asked for patience. By mid-morning, the light widened across the land. The caravan passed low scrub and pale grasses bending in the breeze. Here and there, the ground showed the marks of other journeys, old hoofprints softened by wind, a broken reed from a basket, a circle of stones where someone had once made a small cooking fire. Wheel ruts crossed a flat stretch of earth and disappeared into harder ground. A line of hills rested blue-gray in the distance, seeming near for a long while, before slowly becoming nearer in truth. The travelers spoke in low voices. Some shared a language. Others knew only a few useful words in common: water, price, road, bread, tomorrow. In the market towns and resting places of Central Asia, Western China, Persia, and beyond, many languages could be heard, depending on the time and place. Forms of Persian, Turkic languages, Chinese, Sogdian, Arabic, Tibetan, and others might appear along different routes. Often, one traveler helped another understand. A merchant might know enough of a neighboring tongue to bargain. A guide might speak with villagers. A scribe or interpreter might be found in a town. Understanding, like trade, often moves step by step. At midday, the caravan paused where a rock cast a narrow strip of shade. There was not much of it, but enough for a few people to sit with their backs to stone, while others stood beside the animals. A tamarisk tree, hardy and fine-leaved, grew nearby where the ground dipped slightly. Its shade was thin but pleasant. Water skins were opened carefully. Each one mattered. The animals were checked, straps loosened, knots retied, and loads balanced again. No one hurried more than necessary. The road taught a steady kind of attention. A loose rope was fixed before it became a problem. A tired animal was noticed before it lagged too far behind. A cartwheel was examined when it began to squeak. A traveler who had been quiet too long was offered a drink. Cooperation was not grand or ceremonial, it was made of small practical acts repeated through the day. After the pause, the caravan moved on. Again came the footfalls, the creak of leather, the soft clink of metal rings, the faint bells marking time. The sun leaned westward, shadows lengthened beside stones and low bushes. The heat in the distance shimmered like a veil over the pale road, and then slowly thinned as afternoon passed. Ahead, the guide pointed toward a darker line near the horizon. At first, it looked like a change in the earth itself. Then, little by little, the color deepened. Pale land gave way to hints of green. A few trees appeared, then more, their leaves gathered softly against the sky. The dust beneath the animals' feet darkened in patches, as though the ground remembered water. Soon there was another sound beneath the bells and footsteps. It was slight at first, a murmur almost hidden by the movement of the caravan. Water, running in a narrow channel, touching stones, slipping past reeds. The travelers continued toward it at the same gentle pace, while the first cool breath of an oasis settlement moved across the road. Chapter 4. An Oasis Settlement. After many hours of pale road and open sky, the first sign of an oasis might be very small. It could be a darker line at the edge of the distance, where trees gathered close together. It could be a patch of green where the earth seemed to soften. It could be the faint sound of water, not yet visible, moving somewhere beyond a wall or field. For travelers who had crossed dry ground, such signs were important. They were not only pleasant to see, they meant water, shade, food, repair, and news from the road ahead. An oasis was a place in a dry region where water allowed people, animals, and plants to live. Some oases were modest settlements with a few gardens and houses. Others grew into busy towns with markets, workshops, religious buildings, and places where caravans could stop. Along the routes that later came to be called the Silk Road, oases were essential. They formed a chain of resting places across difficult landscapes, especially near deserts and dry basins, where travelers often followed the edges from one watered place to the next. As the caravan approached, the road might pass between low fields bordered by earthen banks. The dust beneath the animals' feet would darken in places where water had recently seeped into the ground. A small canal, a man-made channel for carrying water, might run beside the path. Its surface would catch the light in narrow flashes, and reeds might lean over it with a soft rustle. Irrigation was the careful bringing of water to fields and gardens. In an oasis, irrigation could make the difference between bare earth and harvest. Water might come from a spring, a well, a river branch, a reservoir, or a cistern, which was a storage place for water. In some regions, people also built underground channels that guided water from hills or higher ground toward fields and homes. Such systems took planning, labor, and maintenance. They had to be cleared of silt, repaired after damage, and shared according to local rules. The green of the oasis, then, was not a simple gift. It was also the result of many hands working across many seasons. Near the entrance to the settlement, children might carry small jars from a well, walking carefully so the water did not spill. A gardener might lift a wooden gate in a channel and let water slide into a furrow between rows of vegetables. The water would murmur along the line of the field, darkening the soil as it went. Nearby, an older person might watch the flow, making sure it reached one bed, but did not waste itself in another. In places where water was limited, people learned to notice every small sound and movement of it. The houses were often made of mud brick or packed earth, materials shaped from the ground itself. Their walls held the warmth of the sun during the day and could give back a softer heat in the evening, with flat roofs and small windows. Others stood around courtyards shaded by vines or trees. The thick walls helped keep rooms cool, while the inner spaces gave families a protected place to cook, mend, talk, and store grain. Beyond the houses, gardens spread in ordered patches. Wheat and barley might grow in fields where the water was steady enough. Grapevines could be trained over frames, making cool shade beneath their leaves. In the right season, clusters of grapes hung quietly in the green light, and people sat below them to sort baskets, tie bundles, or rest for a short while. Melons grew close to the ground, their round shapes hidden among broad leaves. Apricots ripened in orchards, and after harvest were sometimes cut and laid on trays to dry in the sun. Their orange halves softened and darkened slowly, becoming food that could be stored or carried onward. In suitable climates, there might be pomegranates with red blossoms and heavy fruit. There could be onions, herbs, and other vegetables in small garden beds. In some silk-producing regions, mulberry trees grew near homes and fields. The leaves of the mulberry were important because silkworms fed on them. A silkworm is the caterpillar that makes a silk cocoon, and from these cocoons people learned to draw the fine thread that could be woven into silk. Not every oasis made silk, and not every mulberry tree belonged to silk production, but in some places the trees formed part of a quiet chain of work: leaves, worms, cocoons, thread, cloth. The settlement held more than farms. At its center, or along a main road, there might be a small market space where local people sold grain, fruit, pottery, cloth, rope, oil, and simple tools. A caravan stop might stand near the gate or beside a broad courtyard where animals could be watered. Workshops might open onto shaded lanes: a potter shaping clay, a leather worker trimming straps, a carpenter smoothing a door plank, a weaver listening to the steady rhythm of a loom. A shrine, mosque, monastery, temple, or other religious building might stand nearby, depending on the region and time, its doorway quiet in the afternoon. Travelers entering such a place would not see abundance without effort. They would see cooperation. Someone had repaired the canal wall. Someone had cleaned the well. Someone had counted the turns by which families received water. Someone had planted trees that would not give full shade for years. Someone had stored seed grain and watched the sky for the season's changes. The caravan animals would be led toward troughs or watering places where they drank slowly. Packs would be loosened. Dust would settle on the road behind them. A driver might rinse his hands and face, then sit in the shade with a bowl of yogurt or a piece of bread. A merchant might ask about prices in the next town. A local farmer might ask what cloth had arrived from another valley. News moved this way, as gently as water through channels, passing from person to person, never all at once, but steadily. Through the afternoon, leaves moved softly in the warm air. The mud brick walls glowed in the sun, then slowly cooled as shadows lengthened. Apricots lay drying on reed trays. Water continued to run in small canals, turning at corners, slipping beneath little bridges, and disappearing into gardens. By evening, cooking smoke rose from courtyards, and animals stood quietly in pens. The settlement gathered itself inward. Jars were filled, baskets covered, tools put away. Yet before long, morning would return. Shutters would open to the first light. Baskets would be lifted onto arms and shoulders. Awnings would be unfurled above the market street, and people would begin moving there, step by step, carrying the produce, craft, and careful work of the oasis into another day. Chapter 5. Market Morning. By the time the sun had lifted above the roofs of the oasis town, the market had already begun to open. Awnings of woven cloth stretched from wooden poles, making soft patches of shade along the street. The air was still cool in the narrow lanes, and the packed earth held the marks of sandals, cartwheels, and the small hooves of donkeys. A few shutters were raised, a few baskets were set down. One by one the stalls took shape, not with haste, but with the practiced rhythm of people who knew where each thing belonged. In towns along the many routes later called the Silk Road, markets served everyday needs as much as distant trade. A traveler might arrive hoping to buy fodder for animals or a new strap for a saddlebag. A local household might come for grain, onions, thread, lamp oil, or a clay bowl to replace one that had cracked. Long-distance goods did appear, sometimes wrapped carefully in cloth or leather, but most market mornings were also about bread for the day, salt for the kitchen, tools for work, and news from the next town. Near the entrance to the market, a baker laid flat rounds of bread under a clean cloth. They were still warm, and a faint steam rose when the cloth was lifted. The bread smelled of toasted grain and ash from the oven wall. Beside the baker, a woman arranged shallow baskets of fruit, grapes with a pale bloom on their skins, apricots soft from the sun, melons cut open to show their cool flesh, and raisins dried for keeping through the season. In another basket lay nuts, perhaps walnuts or almonds, depending on the region and the harvest. A few steps farther on, sacks of grain leaned against a wall. Wheat, barley, and millet might be sold by measure, scooped into bowls or baskets whose size everyone in the town understood. Measures were important, because trust in trade often began with ordinary fairness. A seller might smooth the top of a measure with the side of the hand, while a buyer watched quietly. There was no need for hurry. This was a familiar exchange, repeated many times, season after season. At a cloth stall, folded textiles rested in soft stacks. Some were plain and practical, woven for shirts, wraps, or household use. Some were wool, warm and sturdy. Some were cotton in regions where it was grown or traded. A finer piece of silk might be kept a little higher, protected from dust, catching a muted shine in the morning light. Silk was famous, but not everyone wore it, and it was not the only thing that mattered. Along these routes, humble cloth, felt, thread, rope, and leather were just as necessary to daily life. The cloth seller lifted a length of dyed fabric and let it fall across the counter in a quiet wave. Nearby, small bundles of thread were tied in loops, red, indigo, yellow, brown, and undyed white. Dyes came from many sources, including plants, minerals, and sometimes insects, and their colors depended on local knowledge. A dyer knew how long to soak the thread, how to heat the water, and how to fix the color so it would last through sun and washing. The market hummed gently. People greeted one another by name. Children carried small errands for their households. A stable hand paused to look at a new iron tool. A potter set bowls and jars in the shade, where the clay stayed cool to the touch. Some vessels were rough and useful, made for storage or cooking. Others had smooth surfaces, painted lines or glazes that caught a little light. A buyer turned a bowl in both hands, feeling its weight, listening for the sound it made when tapped softly. At another stall, leather goods hung from pegs: sandals, belts, pouches, water bags, harness straps, and saddle bags. A saddle bag is a bag made to hang over an animal's saddle, and it was useful for travelers who needed to keep small goods close at hand. The leather smelled warm and earthy. The seller ran fingers along a seam to show the stitching. A camel driver examined a strap, not as a luxury, but as something that must hold steady over many miles. There were spices and aromatics too, though not every household would use them every day. In small bowls or cloth packets lay cumin, coriander, sesame, dried herbs, and perhaps more costly goods brought from farther away. Some spices traveled by sea routes as well as land routes, moving through many hands before reaching an inland stall. Their scents rose softly when a packet was opened, warm, dry, green, and faintly sweet. Bargaining began in low voices. Bargaining simply means discussing the price until both sides agree. It does not have to be sharp or unfriendly. Often it is a social habit with polite words, pauses, and gestures. A buyer names one price. The seller smiles and names another. They speak of quality, distance, harvest, weight, and need. Sometimes the agreement is made with coins. Sometimes goods are exchanged for other goods. In some places, silver might be weighed. In others, local currencies, credit, or written promises might be used. At a merchant's table, brass or bronze weights were placed carefully on a scale. A scale is a tool for weighing, and in a market it helps turn trust into something visible. One pan held the weight. The other held a small amount of metal, spice, dye, or medicine. The balance swayed, then steadied. Beside the scale, a small ledger lay open. A ledger is a record book for accounts. Not everyone in the market could read or write, and many agreements were remembered by word, reputation, family, or repeated trade. But written records were useful for larger dealings, credit arrangements, and goods that might travel onward. A seal might also be used. A seal is a marked stamp that shows identity, ownership, or approval. It might be pressed into clay, wax, or ink, depending on the time and place. A sealed bundle could tell the next handler that it had not been opened. A sealed document could show who had agreed to a contract. Such small marks helped goods move through stages from town to town, rather than always with one merchant across the whole distance. Languages mingled gently in the market air. In one town, a traveler might hear forms of Persian and Turkic speech. In another, Chinese, Sogdian, Tibetan, Arabic, Sanskrit, Greek, or other languages might appear, depending on the region and the century. No single market contained every language, and no single tongue belonged to all the roads. Interpreters, guides, multilingual merchants, and local helpers made understanding possible. Sometimes a price was translated in a few words, sometimes a hand gesture, a number mark, or a familiar measure was enough. News traveled here as surely as cloth and grain. A person newly arrived from another oasis spoke of a canal being repaired, a bridge reopened, a tax collected at a gate, or a caravan expected in 3 days. A monk asked about lodging, a messenger bought bread, a local farmer listened for the price of barley. A craft worker asked whether good indigo had come in. Market talk was practical, but through such talk the wider world entered the town in small, ordinary pieces. Luxury goods and everyday goods rested side by side. A small piece of patterned silk might lie near a bundle of rope. A polished metal cup might sit not far from a stack of cooking pots. A packet of fine aromatic resin might be sold near salt, onions, and repair tools. This mingling was part of the market's quiet balance. The distant and the local met not as a grand event, but as part of the morning's work. As the sun rose higher, the awnings shifted gently in the breeze. Shadows moved from one side of the lane to the other. The first rush of buying settled into a calmer flow. A merchant tied shut a pouch of coins. A potter wrapped 2 bowls in straw. The baker folded the cloth over the remaining bread. Somewhere, a scale weight was set back in its proper box, with a soft sound. Near the edge of the market, a household member chose a small bundle of thread, a measure of grain, and a handful of dried apricots. The purchases were wrapped in cloth and carried close. Passing beneath the shade of a mud brick wall, the person turned away from the market's low hum and into a quieter lane. Behind them, voices continued, soft and steady. Ahead, the lanes narrowed toward homes built around inner courtyards, where water jars waited in cool rooms, mats lay in shade, and the work of the day would continue in another gentle rhythm. Chapter 6. Inside a merchant's courtyard home. Leaving the market street, the sound of bargaining and passing sandals grew softer, as if a woven curtain had been drawn across the morning. A narrow lane turned away from the stalls and led between walls of sun-warmed brick. The air here was quieter. A donkey shifted in the shade beside a doorway. Somewhere behind a wall, a wooden bowl was set down with a low, hollow sound. In many towns along the Silk Road routes, especially in warm and dry regions, homes often turned inward around a courtyard. A courtyard was an open space inside the house, under the sky but enclosed by rooms and walls. From the street, such a house might look plain, with a solid door and few windows. Inside, however, the courtyard brought light and air into daily life. It gave shade as the sun moved, privacy from the busy lanes, and a protected place where children, elders, workers, relatives, and guests could share the rhythm of the day. This particular home belonged to a merchant's household, though that could mean many things. Some merchants were wealthy, with large storerooms and fine carved wood. Others were modest traders who carried cloth, dried fruit, or household goods from one town to the next. This house was comfortable but practical. Its walls were made of mud brick, dried hard in the sun, with plaster smoothed over the inner surfaces. In some towns, houses might use baked brick, timber beams, reed mats, stone or carved screens, depending on what local builders had close at hand. Here the building kept the daytime heat outside and gathered a pool of shade within. The courtyard floor was packed earth, swept clean. Woven mats lay near one wall, their fibers softened by use. A vine climbed a wooden frame and spread leaves overhead, making a shifting pattern of green and gold. In one corner, a small tree grew from a square of earth, its trunk thin but steady. The shade moved slowly across the courtyard wall, marking time more gently than any bell. Along the cool side of the house was a storage room, its doorway covered by a hanging cloth. Inside, large jars stood in rows. Some held grain, some held oil, some held water, and others may have held dried fruit, salted foods, or seeds saved for later. A storage jar is simply a large vessel made to keep useful things safe from heat, dust, and insects. The clay was cool to the touch. When a hand lifted a lid, there was a faint smell of wheat, or sesame, or apricots dried in the sun. Water was treated carefully here, as it was in many dry places. A household might draw it from a well, carry it from a neighborhood source, or receive it through channels that served the town. In the courtyard, a jar of water stood in the shade. A cup was dipped in, lifted slowly, and passed from one person to another. Nothing was hurried. The small sound of water against clay was part of the house's quiet music. Near the hearth, flatbread, warmed under a cloth. A hearth is the place where a cooking fire is kept, sometimes built low in the floor, sometimes raised, and sometimes shared with an oven or clay stove. The smell of warm bread drifted through the courtyard. A pot waited nearby, and a small bundle of fuel was stacked against the wall. In regions where wood was scarce, households might use dried dung, reeds, brush, or other local fuels. Daily cooking depended on the landscape as much as travel did. In another corner, two children sat beside a shallow basket. They were sorting dates, setting the softest ones to one side and the firmer ones to another. Nearby, another child wound thread around a small spindle, learning by watching older hands. Children in many households learn through small tasks, sorting beans, carrying water, sweeping mats, holding thread, watching accounts being counted, or helping tend a goat or a few chickens in a shaded pen. These were not lessons written on a board, but practical teachings repeated day after day. Against the wall, an older woman mended a length of cloth. Her fingers moved with patient skill, drawing the thread through a worn place until the fabric was strong again. Beside her, a younger relative twisted wool into yarn. Spinning thread was an ordinary household skill in many regions, though the materials varied. Some homes worked with wool from sheep, others with cotton, flax, or silk thread, depending on the climate, wealth, and local craft traditions. Cloth was valuable because it took time. Time to grow fiber, time to prepare it, time to spin, weave, dye, cut, mend, and wear. Not far away, an elder sat near the doorway to a shaded room, listening as a visitor spoke of road conditions and market prices. In many societies along these routes, households could include several generations, though arrangements differed from town to town and family to family. Grandparents, parents, children, cousins, apprentices, servants, or business partners might all pass through the same courtyard during a day. A house was not only a private place. It could also be a workshop, a storehouse, a small office, and a place of hospitality. The merchant sat at a low table with a ledger, a record book used for accounts. He opened a cloth pouch and counted small coins, then set them aside, beside a few written notes. Not every agreement was written down. Trust, reputation, kinship, and repeated trade mattered deeply. Still, records helped a household remember what had been sold, what was owed, and which goods were stored for the next journey. A seal, wrapped carefully in cloth, rested near the ledger. Such a seal could mark ownership or approval when pressed into clay, wax, or ink. The courtyard gathered these activities without fuss. Cooking, mending, counting, teaching, storing, pouring, sweeping. Each task returned in its own time. Outside, the market continued. Pack animals moved through the lanes. A seller called softly from under an awning. But within the walls, the house held a steadier rhythm. A bowl was rinsed and placed upside down to dry. The sorted dates were poured into a smaller dish. Thread was wound and tucked away. The ledger was closed, then tied with a cord. The shade had shifted again, and the warm light now touched the upper wall. Near the hearth, someone set a pot closer to the fire. Bread was wrapped in a clean cloth to keep it soft. Cups were arranged in a careful row. One by one, the members of the household drew nearer, bringing with them the small work of the day, and the courtyard became, for a little while, a place gathered around a simple meal. Chapter 7. Food, Tea, and Shared Tables. By the time the sun had climbed above the courtyard wall, the day's first errands had softened into the familiar rhythm of preparing food. In a town along one of the many Silk Road routes, a meal might begin with grain, water, fire, and patient hands. It might be a small meal for a household, or a larger one shared by travelers who had arrived with dust on their sandals and news from the road. There was no single Silk Road meal, just as there was no single Silk Road. Foods changed from region to region and from century to century. What people ate depended on climate, local fields, trade connections, wealth, custom, and season. Yet, in many places, the same comforting motions appeared again and again. Dough pressed flat, soup stirred slowly, cups warmed, fruit sliced, bowls passed from hand to hand. Near a clay oven, a cook shaped rounds of dough with practiced movements. Flatbread was common across many lands, though it took different forms in different kitchens. Some breads were slapped against the hot inner wall of an oven, where they puffed and browned in the heat. Others were baked on a flat stone, on metal, or under ashes. The smell rose gently, warm and dry, with a faint sweetness from the grain. Wheat was important in many Silk Road regions, especially in Central Asia and Western lands. Barley and millet also fed households, animals, and travelers. In some places, wheat dough became noodles or dumplings, stretched, cut, folded, or pinched into small shapes before being dropped into broth. Noodle-like foods existed in several Eurasian traditions, long before later stories claimed that one famous traveler brought pasta from China to Italy. Food habits moved slowly, often in many directions, and people shaped them according to local taste. In suitable regions, rice filled bowls instead of wheat or barley. Rice needed more water than many dry zone crops, so it belonged especially to river valleys, wetter lands, and carefully irrigated fields. Along the roads, a traveler might find rice in one town, barley porridge in another, and wheat bread in the next. Each place offered what its soil, water, and memory knew how to provide. In a shaded kitchen, soup simmered quietly. A few onions softened in fat. Garlic might be crushed with herbs. If the household had meat, small pieces of lamb or mutton could be added, giving the broth a deeper flavor. Sheep and goats were common in many pastoral and farming communities, and they gave more than meat. They gave milk, wool, hides, and sometimes dried dung for fuel where wood was scarce. A clay bowl of yogurt cooled near the wall, smooth and pale. Yogurt is a kind of fermented dairy, meaning milk changed by helpful natural bacteria into something tangy and thicker. In many regions, people also made cheese, dried curds, and other milk foods that could keep longer than fresh milk. Such foods were practical for travelers and herders. Dried curds could be tucked into a bag, carried over distance, and softened later in water or soup. Nearby, a small dish was filled with raisins and nuts. Grapes grew well in many oasis and valley regions, and when dried, they became raisins that traveled easily. Apricots, too, could be dried on trays in the sun, their orange halves shrinking into sweet, chewy pieces. Melons appeared in season, cool and fragrant, especially in places where careful irrigation made gardens possible. Walnuts, almonds, and pistachios might be offered in small amounts, depending on the region and the household. In western and southern lands, dates could bring their soft sweetness to the table. Not every meal was rich with spices. Some spices and aromatics were valuable, and their use depended on place and means. A market seller might have cumin, coriander, sesame, dried herbs, or fragrant resins nearby, but an ordinary pot often relied on simpler flavors. Grain, onion, salt, sour dairy, fresh herbs are the quiet savor of long cooking. Still, even a pinch of cumin warming in fat, or toasted sesame scattered over bread, could make a simple meal feel complete. Foodways, the customs and habits around food, traveled with people. Merchants carried more than bales and ledgers. Migrants brought seeds and cooking memories. Soldiers learned local dishes while stationed far from home. Monks and pilgrims accepted meals in monasteries, caravanserais in village homes, then carried stories of those meals onward. Cooks adapted what they heard and tasted. Families formed across language and region. And in their courtyards, recipes changed gently from one generation to the next. In some periods and places, tea was poured. Tea began in China and spread gradually along routes of trade, diplomacy, migration, and exchange. It became especially important in certain regions, including parts of Inner Asia and Tibet, but it was not universal everywhere or in every century. Where it was known, tea leaves might unfold slowly in hot water, releasing a soft fragrance into the room. In other places, people drank water, milk, fermented drinks, fruit syrups, or warm broths according to local custom. The meal itself unfolded without hurry. Bread was passed, bowls were filled. A traveler dipped a piece of flatbread into soup. Someone set yogurt beside the warm food, cooling the tongue. A child watched carefully and learned when to offer the next cup, when to bring more bread, when to sit quietly and listen. Around shared tables, news moved as naturally as dishes: the condition of a canal, the price of grain, the arrival of a caravan from a nearby town. The best season for crossing a pass. Afterward, cups were set down softly. The last raisins were gathered into a palm. Bowls were rinsed, and turned upside down to dry. Crumbs were brushed from the mat, and a cloth was folded over the remaining bread. The cooking fire settled into a low red glow. Beyond the courtyard, the afternoon resumed its steady work. From one doorway came the rhythmic hush of a loom. From another, the slow turning of a potter's wheel. Farther off, a hammer tapped metal in even, softened beats. The meal had ended, but the day continued, carried onward by patient hands. Chapter 8. Workshops and Skilled Hands. Beyond the market street, where awnings stirred gently and baskets of fruit rested in the shade, there were quieter lanes where the work of the town continued in steady rhythms. Here, behind wooden doors or beneath open-fronted shelters, artisans shaped the things that travelers carried, used, admired, and traded. Craft production was vital in many Silk Road towns. A caravan might bring distant goods from another oasis or valley, but local hands made the bowls, saddles, cloth, tools, paper, and carved boxes that filled daily life. In one workshop, a weaver sat before a loom, a frame used to turn threads into cloth. The loom was simple in shape, yet it held a whole pattern of knowledge. Threads stretched lengthwise, tight and even. A shuttle moved back and forth through them, carrying another thread across. With each pass, the weaver pressed the new line into place. Back and forth, pause and press. Back and forth, pause and press. The sound was soft and regular, like a small wooden heartbeat inside the room. Not all cloth was silk. Many people wore wool, cotton, linen in some regions, or felt, a thick, warm material made by pressing wool fibers together. Everyday fabrics were practical, chosen for climate, work, and cost. Fine silk, however, was famous. Early silk making was strongly associated with China, where people learned long ago how to raise silkworms, feed them mulberry leaves, and unwind the delicate thread from their cocoons. A silkworm is the caterpillar that makes a silk cocoon, and mulberry leaves are its favored food. Over time, the knowledge of sericulture, raising silkworms to make silk, spread beyond China to other regions, though not everywhere at once. In a courtyard nearby, skeins of thread hung from a line in the shade. Some were pale as cream, others had been colored in deep reds, soft yellows, leaf greens, and blues that seemed to hold a little of the evening sky. Dyers used materials available to them, plants, minerals, and sometimes insects, depending on the region and period. A dye is simply a substance used to give color to thread, cloth, or leather. In small bowls along the wall, colored powders waited beside bundles of dried leaves and roots. The dyer's hands moved carefully, rinsing, wringing, and spreading the threads so they could dry evenly in the quiet air. Farther along the lane, a potter turned clay on a wheel. The wheel moved slowly, guided by foot and hand. A lump of wet earth rose under the potter's fingers, first round, then hollow, then gently widened into a bowl. Clay remembered pressure. A thumb at the center made space. A palm along the outside gave shape. The potter did not hurry. When one vessel was finished, it joined others on a board, waiting to dry before firing in a kiln, an oven made hot enough to harden clay. Some pots would hold grain or oil, some would carry water, some would be painted, glazed, or traded, while others would remain in the homes of the town. The lane carried faint sounds from other workshops. From one doorway came the softened tapping of a hammer on metal. Metal workers made many useful things: knives, buckles, cooking pots, lamps, locks, needles, and fittings for saddles and carts. Some worked in bronze, copper, iron, steel, silver, or gold, depending on place, skill, and need. A small hinge, a nail, or a ring for a harness might not seem grand, but such objects helped caravans move and households function. Trade depended not only on rare luxuries, but on ordinary things that held together under daily use. A wood carver sat at a low bench where pale shavings curled like ribbons. The wood had a clean, dry scent. With a small blade, the carver shaped a box lid, smoothing the edge again and again until it fit neatly. Wooden bowls, combs, door panels, writing boards, and chests could all pass through such hands. Nearby, a leather worker drew a cord through softened hide, mending a saddlebag. Leather straps, shoes, belts, water skins, and harness pieces were part of the practical fabric of travel. A water skin made from prepared animal hide could carry precious water between wells. A good strap could keep a load steady over many miles. In some towns where the knowledge had arrived and materials were at hand, paper makers worked with vats of wet fiber. Paper technology began in China and spread westward through Central Asia into the Islamic world, becoming important in many places over time. It did not appear everywhere at once, but where it was made, it changed the work of scribes, merchants, teachers, and religious communities. In a quiet paper-making yard, a worker dipped a fine screen into cloudy water filled with loosened fibers. When the screen lifted, a thin wet sheet lay across it. The sheet was set aside carefully to drain and dry. Later it might hold a letter, a poem, a contract, an account, or a copied prayer. Glassmakers too belonged to the wider world of skilled hands. In regions known for glass, sand and other materials were heated until they softened and could be shaped. Some glass became beads, cups, small bottles, or window pieces. A bead might travel farther than the person who made it. A blue glass vessel might pass from one merchant to another, from a city workshop to an oasis home, carrying with it both usefulness and beauty. Many artisans learned through apprenticeship. An apprentice was a learner who trained with a skilled worker, often beginning with simple tasks: sweeping floors, sorting fibers, grinding pigments, kneading clay, carrying water, or watching how a tool was held. In family workshops, children absorbed skills by being near them day after day. They learned the weight of wool, the smell of wet clay, the sound of a proper hammer strike, and the patience needed to make one even row after another. As afternoon light softened, finished goods were folded, stacked, wrapped, or set on shelves. A length of cloth was smoothed by hand. A bundle of dyed thread was tied with cord. A row of bowls cooled in the shade. A small carved box received a mark of ownership. Then from the workshop, a merchant's assistant carried a wrapped parcel and a note toward a quieter room, where ink, paper, and ledgers waited on a low table, and a scribe prepared to set the day's work into careful words. Chapter 9. Scribes, Translators, and Letters. In a quieter lane near the market, where the sound of animals and bargaining softened behind mud brick walls, there might be a small room open to the courtyard light. A reed mat lay on the floor. A low table held folded papers, smooth stones for waiting corners, and a shallow dish of black ink. The ink shone for a moment when stirred, dark and bright before it settled. Here a scribe worked with careful hands. A scribe was a person trained to write documents. In many Silk Road towns, not everyone could read or write, and writing itself was a skill learned through practice, patience, and memory. A scribe might know one script or several. He might write with a brush, a reed pen, or another simple tool shaped for the writing surface at hand. The soft touch of pen on paper, the pause to dip again into ink, and the slow forming of each line made the room feel measured and still. Written words supported many ordinary parts of life along the routes. Merchants needed account books to remember what had been bought, sold, borrowed, or stored. A ledger was such a record book, and its pages could hold lists of cloth, jars of oil, bags of grain, bundles of paper, or bales of wool. A bale was a wrapped bundle of goods, tied and marked, so it could be carried, counted, and recognized. A scribe might prepare a contract, which was an agreement written down so that both sides could remember its terms. He might write a receipt to show that payment had been made, or an inventory to list what was inside a storeroom or caravan load. He might copy a permit for travel through a district, record taxes owed to an authority, or compose a letter for someone sending news to relatives in another town. The materials used for writing varied greatly by place and time. Paper, first developed in China, spread westward over centuries and became especially important in Central Asia and the Islamic world. In some regions, people wrote on parchment, which was prepared animal skin, smooth enough to hold ink. In earlier Chinese settings, wooden and bamboo slips could be tied together in bundles. Elsewhere, cloth or leather might carry a message when those materials were practical and available. On the low table, a folded letter rested beneath a small cord. The letter might be simple: a greeting, a note about health, a reminder of a debt, or news of a caravan expected before winter. Goods often moved in stages, from one town to the next, and words moved with them. A merchant did not need to cross all of Eurasia for his message to travel far. A trusted companion, a relative, a guide, or another trader might carry a letter onward, placing it into another hand at the next stop. Beside the ink dish lay a seal. A seal was a stamp or marked object used to show identity, approval, or ownership. It might be pressed into soft clay, wax, or ink depending on local custom. The mark could close a folded letter, label a bundle, or confirm a document. When the scribe pressed it down, there was only a small sound, a gentle firmness of hand against the table. Then the mark remained, a quiet sign that someone had accepted responsibility for the words. Yet writing was only one part of trust. Many agreements along the Silk Road were spoken aloud, remembered by witnesses, and supported by reputation. A merchant who traded fairly over many seasons became known. Families, religious communities, and merchant networks could help people decide whom to trust. Kinship, shared origin, repeated contact, and local custom all mattered. A written contract could be useful, but so could a familiar face returning year after year with the same careful habits. In towns of Central Asia, Sogdian merchants were especially important during late antiquity and the early medieval period. The Sogdians came from a region around cities such as Samarkand and Bukhara, and many became skilled traders across Central Asia and into China. Their communities, sometimes living far from their homeland, helped connect markets and languages. Such a community is sometimes called a diaspora, meaning people living outside an original homeland while keeping ties of language, family, or trade. In a multilingual town, another quiet worker might sit nearby, an interpreter. An interpreter helped people speaking different languages understand one another. Sometimes this was a professional skill. Sometimes a guide, merchant, monk, or local resident simply knew enough of several tongues to help with prices, directions, or promises. The work could be gentle and practical. A seller spoke, the interpreter murmured the meaning, and the buyer nodded slowly. Numbers were repeated. Measures were checked. A name was written down. Monasteries and religious communities also held important places in this world of words. Along some routes, Buddhist monasteries, Christian communities, Muslim schools, and other religious centers offered lodging, literacy, copying, translation, and artistic exchange, depending on the region and period. A monk might copy a manuscript by lamplight. A traveler might ask for help reading a letter. A sacred text might be translated so that people in another land could understand its teaching. In such places, ink and devotion often shared the same quiet room. As the afternoon lengthened, lamplight began to gather in the corners. The scribes sanded or dried the last line of ink. Papers rustled softly as they were stacked. A ledger was closed and tied with cord. The seal was wrapped and set aside. One letter, folded carefully, was placed in a leather pouch to be carried with the next caravan. Outside, the lane glowed amber. Voices from the market drifted toward evening. Travelers turned back toward the caravanserai, where animals would be unloaded and lamps lit in the niches of the walls. The written words went with them, tucked safely among cloth, coins, and memory. Chapter 10. Evening at the Caravanserai. By the time the sun lowered toward the edge of the plain, the walls of the caravanserai had changed color. What had been pale and dusty in the morning now held a warmer shade, touched with amber light. The main gate stood open, and through it came the slow return of travelers, animals, and goods, all moving at the measured pace of a day nearly finished. A caravanserai was a roadside inn for caravans, a place where people, pack animals, and bundles of goods could pause together. Some were large and built with care, with stone arches and deep storage rooms. Others were simpler, made of mud brick, packed earth, and timber. In many regions they had thick outer walls, one main entrance, and an open courtyard at the center. By evening, that courtyard became a place of quiet order. The animals entered first in small groups. Camels stepped through the gate with bells making soft, uneven notes. A few were Bactrian camels, with 2 humps, common in much of Central Asia. In other regions, travelers might have used 1-humped dromedaries, or horses, mules, donkeys, and oxen. Each animal had its own work, its own pace, and its own need for care. One by one, the camels folded their long legs beneath them and settled onto the packed earth. Their handlers moved with practiced patience, loosening ropes and untying loads. A bale, a wrapped bundle of goods might be lowered from one side, then another bale from the other, so the weight came away evenly. Saddle blankets were lifted and shaken. Leather straps were rubbed between fingers to find worn places. Wooden boxes were set against a wall. Saddlebags were hung from pegs or laid near a traveler's chosen corner. Animals needed rest as much as people did. Stable hands and drivers led them toward water troughs, where the evening light trembled on the surface. Water was never treated carelessly along these routes. It had shaped the day's travel, the choice of road, and the timing of each stop. A well, cistern, spring, or canal could decide where a caravan paused. Now, as the animals drank, the sound was steady and low, joined by the scrape of hooves and the murmur of people checking legs, hooves, and packs. Near one archway, a mule's harness was inspected. Near another, a horse stood calmly while a groom brushed dust from its coat. A camel driver bent to examine a sore place beneath a strap, then patted it with folded cloth for the next day. These small acts were part of travel as surely as the road itself. A journey continued not only because merchants made agreements, but because hands mended rope, filled troughs, counted sacks, and noticed what needed attention. As the courtyard settled, people began to arrange their own places. Blankets were shaken out and spread on raised platforms or in rooms around the open court. Sandals were set neatly beside woven mats. A merchant placed a cloth bundle near his head and tucked a ledger into a leather case. A ledger was a record book for accounts, and in many trading towns such records helped keep track of debts, goods, partnerships, and payments. Yet not every agreement was written down. Trust, memory, kinship, reputation, and repeated dealings also carried weight. Oil lamps were lit in wall niches, small hollow spaces built into the masonry. Their flames gave a soft glow to the arches. Smoke rose from cooking fires in pale threads, nearly straight in the still evening air. Somewhere, lentils simmered with grain. In another corner, a pot of stew warmed slowly, stirred with a wooden spoon. Bread, bought earlier in a market or carried from an oasis town, was softened near the heat. The smell of wool, leather, dust, and food mingled gently. The people gathered here might have come from nearby villages or from towns many days apart. A caravanserai could bring together merchants with cloth and metal goods, pilgrims traveling toward a shrine or monastery, messengers carrying letters, soldiers assigned to a road, monks or scholars with manuscripts, artisans seeking work, and local sellers offering fodder, bread, onions, or dried fruit. Not all would speak the same language. In one place, a traveler might hear forms of Persian or Turkic speech. In another, Chinese, Sogdian, Arabic, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Greek, or other languages might be present, depending on the region and century. Often, someone nearby knew enough words to help. Evening was a natural time for exchanging route news. Voices stayed low beneath the arches. One traveler described the condition of a well 2 days away. Another mentioned a bridge repaired after spring floods. A guide spoke quietly about a safer track along a riverbed, useful while the weather remained mild. Such talk was practical, not grand. It helped people choose when to leave, how much water to carry, and whether to hire another animal or wait for a larger group. In another corner, a small scale was brought out. A scale was a tool for weighing goods, and its metal weights clicked softly as they were set in place. A merchant counted coins into a cloth pouch, while another checked bundles of dyed thread. Some trade was done with coins, some with weighed silver, some with barter, and some through credit, which meant an agreement to pay later. The methods varied from place to place, but everywhere they depended on careful attention. Nearby, a strap was mended. Mending means repairing something, and along the roads it was an evening habit. A torn saddlebag was stitched with thick thread. A cracked wooden peg was replaced. A cook patched a tarrying basket with a strip of reed. These ordinary repairs could seem small, but they made the next morning easier. As the sky darkened, some travelers turned toward prayer or quiet devotion. Across the many centuries and regions of these routes, religious life took many forms. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, Judaism, Hindu traditions, and local beliefs all appeared in different places and times. A caravanserai might stand near a shrine, a mosque, a monastery, or a simple roadside marker. The gestures were not the same everywhere, but the evening mood often invited reflection. A lamp flame, a whispered phrase, a bowed head, or a hand resting quietly on a folded cloth could mark the close of the day. Stories also moved in the low light, though not always in a lively way. Some were only brief memories, a town where grapes grew under trellises, a market famous for blue pottery, a pass that opened late after snow, a scribe who wrote beautifully, a baker whose bread stayed soft for days. Goods traveled in stages along these roads, and so did news, recipes, songs, and small images of distant places. Most travelers did not cross all of Eurasia. Instead, one person carried something to one town, another took it farther, and another gave it a new name in a new language. Above the courtyard, the first stars appeared in the open rectangle of sky. The walls held the day's warmth for a little while, then slowly released it into the cooling air. Bowls were rinsed and stacked. A last ladle touched the side of a pot. Ledgers were tied shut. The gatekeeper drew the great door inward, and the sound of the outside road softened behind it. The animals settled with folded legs, breathing slowly. People lowered their voices. The lamps in the niches glowed like small pools of gold against mud, brick, and stone. Beyond the walls, the roads continued in many directions, toward oases, river valleys, desert edges, and far market towns. And farther still, beyond the warmer plains, other paths climbed into cooler air. There, among high ridges and narrow passes, caravans moved more slowly under wool cloaks, with hooves tapping stone and stars shining clear above the mountain road. Chapter 11. Mountains, Passes, and High Roads. Beyond the oasis fields and the long, pale roads of the desert edge, some routes lifted slowly toward the mountains. The air changed little by little. It grew cooler in the morning, clearer at midday, and sharper when the sun moved behind the ridges. A traveler who had spent many days among mud brick walls, orchards, and dry riverbeds might begin to see snow far ahead, resting quietly on the higher slopes like folded white cloth. Not every traveler along the great route network crossed such mountains. Many journeys stayed within valleys, deserts, plains, or sea lanes. Goods often moved in stages, from one town to the next, and then into other hands. Still, the high roads mattered. Mountain routes helped connect Central Asia with China, South Asia, and the Iranian world. Across different centuries and regions, travelers might hear of the Pamirs, the Tian Shan, the Hindu Kush, the Karakoram, or the Zagros on western routes. These names belong not to one road, but to wide landscapes of passes, valleys, grazing lands, and villages where movement followed the shape of stone and weather. A pass was a way through mountains, often a lower place between higher ridges. In warmer months, when snow had softened or withdrawn, a pass could open like a narrow doorway. In colder seasons, some high paths were avoided or closed for a time. Travel here depended on patience and local knowledge. A guide from a nearby village might know where the path crossed a stream, where loose stones gathered after winter, and where animals could find pasture. Pasture means grazing land, and in the mountains it could be limited, appearing in small green patches beside water or on slopes where grasses grew briefly in the sun. The caravan moved more slowly in such country. Hooves tapped on stone with a light, hollow sound. Leather straps creaked. The bells on pack animals rang more clearly in the thinner air. Thin air simply means air that feels lighter at high places, where breathing can take more effort. Travelers adapted by walking steadily, pausing often, and choosing their hours with care. The purpose was not speed, but safe and measured progress, one ridge, one bend, and one village at a time. The animals changed with the land. Horses, mules, and donkeys were useful on many mountain paths. Mules born from horse and donkey parents were valued in many places for their careful footing and patient strength. In high Himalayan or Tibetan regions, yaks could carry loads and provide hair, milk, and dung fuel. A yak is a long-haired animal suited to cold uplands. In some high, cold desert regions, camels also served travelers, especially the sturdy two-humped Bactrian camels of Central Asia. No single animal belonged everywhere. Each road had its own habits, shaped by climate, custom, and what local people knew best. A merchant who had worn a light robe in a warm town might add a wool cloak, a felt cap, or fur-lined outerwear in higher country. Felt is thick cloth made by pressing wool fibers together until they hold fast. It could become a mat, a boot liner, a saddle pad, or a warm covering. Layers were practical, because mountain days could change from bright sun to cold shadow with surprising gentleness. Cool wind moved over wool sleeves. Breath sometimes appeared in pale clouds before vanishing into the clear air. In the late afternoon, a small mountain village might come into view. First there would be a line of smoke, rising from a hearth behind a low wall. Then a cluster of houses, built from stone, earth, timber, or whatever the region provided. A hearth was the place where a household kept its cooking fire, and in a cold village, it was often the center of warmth and conversation. Near the houses, sheep or goats shifted in a pen. A dog lifted its head, then settled again. A child carrying a bundle of sticks paused to watch the arriving animals, while an elder stood near a doorway, wrapped in a thick cloak. Such villages were important to the high roads. They might offer food, shelter, fresh animals, or a guide for the next stretch. They might trade cheese, wool, dried meat, grain, or mountain herbs for salt, cloth, metal tools, beads, or news from towns below. A small exchange could be as meaningful as a large caravan bargain. A strap repaired, a hoof checked, a water skin filled from a cold spring. These quiet tasks helped the wider network continue. Inside a village room, lamplight touched rough wooden bowls and folded blankets. Smoke from a small mountain hearth scented the air. A pot simmered slowly, perhaps with grain, lentils, or pieces of dried food softened in water. Travelers did not need a feast. Warmth, simple food, and a sheltered corner were enough. Outside, the animals stood near a wall where the wind was calmer, their breath rising in slow white clouds. Saddlebags rested on the ground. Packs were checked and covered against night damp. Above the village, snow glowed softly on distant ridges. The last light faded from stone to silver and then to blue. In the clear high air, stars appeared bright and close, scattered above the dark shapes of the mountains. Somewhere beyond those ridges, other valleys led downward toward orchards, markets, monasteries, workshops, and caravanserais. The high roads did not stand apart from the rest of the Silk Road network. They were another kind of thread, lifted into colder air, joining one region to another through patience and careful passage. As night settled, blankets were drawn close. The animals folded their legs or stood quietly near the wall. A small village lamp shone in the distance, steady and warm against the dark. Overhead, the stars rested above ridges that connected many routes below. Chapter 12. Night, Rest, and the Long Thread of Exchange. By the time night settled fully over the caravanserai, the dust of the day had found its place again on the ground. It lay softly along the edges of the courtyard, in the shallow marks left by sandals, hooves, and cartwheels. The stones, warmed for hours by the sun, began to cool beneath the open sky. A light breeze moved through the gate passage and touched the hanging straps, the folded cloths, the quiet piles of baggage arranged beneath the arches. Around the courtyard, the work of the evening had slowly come to an end. The last bowls had been rinsed and stacked near a jar of water. A cook covered the remaining bread with a cloth, saving it for morning. A merchant tied a cord around his ledger, the record book where numbers, names, and promises had been written in careful lines. Near the stable area, camels rested with folded legs, their long necks curved comfortably, their breathing slow and even. A donkey shifted once, then grew still. Somewhere close by, a horse pulled softly at its feed. The gate was closed for the night. Inside these walls there was a pause in the movement of the roads. And yet, even in stillness, the long thread of exchange remained. The Silk Road, as we call it now, was never one single road. It was a network of many routes, branching and rejoining across deserts, river valleys, grasslands, mountains, and seas. In earlier times, travelers would not have used that modern name. They would have spoken of the road to the next oasis, the pass through the mountains, the ferry across the river, the way toward a market town, or the track that followed a line of wells. Nor was it one single culture. It was a mosaic of many local lives, connected by movement. A town near the Gansu corridor was not the same as a market near Kashgar, or a farm outside Merv, or a workshop in Samarkand, or a mountain village beneath the Pamirs. Each place had its own language sounds, its own cooking smells, its own customs for greeting, bargaining, praying, building, planting, and remembering. Still, the routes held them in quiet relation. Goods often moved step by step, rather than from one end of the world to the other in a single journey. A bale of silk might pass from one merchant to another, from a storehouse to a caravan, from a caravan to a market, from a market to a household or a court. A packet of medicine, a bundle of paper, a dyed cloth, a glass cup, a pouch of seeds, or a small bag of spice might travel in the same patient way, carried by many hands over many seasons. Ideas traveled like this too. A story told at one fire might be remembered at another. A pattern seen on a bowl might appear later in woven cloth. A religious text might be copied in a monastery, carried by a pilgrim, translated by a scholar, and read aloud in a distant town. A recipe might change gently as it moved, taking on a local herb, or another way of shaping dough. Writing materials, medical knowledge, scripts, songs, crops, and artistic styles all traveled slowly, carried not only by famous merchants, but by monks, cooks, gardeners, guides, artisans, soldiers, families, and messengers. So much depended on ordinary care. Someone had to water the animals, someone had to mend the harness, tighten the rope, patch the saddlebag, and count the bundles before the gate opened. Someone had to bake bread before dawn, fill waterskins, store grain, sweep a shop front, set weights beside a scale, translate a price, copy a letter, or press a seal into soft wax or clay. Someone had to tend the canals that carried water into an oasis garden. Someone had to clear silt from a channel, lift a bucket from a well, close a small wooden gate to guide the flow, and watch that each field received its share. Someone had to guide travelers across a stretch of dry land, point out the next landmark, or remember which pass was open in which season. It was made of rest stops and wells, bridges and ferries, farms and orchards, markets and workshops, caravanserais and courtyard homes. It was made also of quieter places, a shaded room where accounts were checked, a monastery where manuscripts were copied, a stable where animals were brushed down, a doorway where elders listened to news from the road. The routes were shaped by larger forces too. Rulers taxed trade and built stations. Climate opened some ways and made others difficult. Illness, conflict, inequality, and uncertainty were also part of the world through which travelers moved. The Silk Road was not always gentle, and it was not always fair. But beneath the rise and fall of cities and empires, daily life continued in practical rhythms, repeated across generations. Water poured, bread baked, threads crossed on looms, ink dried on paper, animals breathed in the shade, gates opened in the morning and closed again at night. Now in the caravanserai courtyard the lamps burned lower. One by one they were covered or pinched out, leaving only a soft glow in a few wall niches. The smell of warm clay, wool, leather, and cooled ashes rested in the air. A traveler pulled a wool blanket close. Another placed his sandals neatly beside his mat. A pack driver checked one final knot, then let his hands fall still. Above the walls the sky was clear. The stars shone over many branching roads, over desert tracks and mountain passes, over orchards, canals, market roofs, and quiet villages. They shone over places where tomorrow someone would open a stall, lead an animal to water, lift bread from an oven, weigh a parcel, translate a word, or begin a journey of only a few miles. For tonight, nothing more was needed. The bowls were stacked, the ledgers were tied, the animals were resting with folded legs. The courtyard stones were cool after sunset, and a light breeze waited at the closed gate. The road would still be there in the morning.